Welcome to the TTS Early Years podcast. Now, each week we're going to be joined by different educational experts from across the globe who are going to offer exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help us as practitioners unlock all the potential for learning that there is in the early years. So to be first to hear about future episodes and to access all of the follow-up content, including ideas for your own setting, Pinterest, mood boards, and loads more, you can sign up for exclusive access using the link in our podcast description. Hello and welcome back to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg. And again, in this episode, I'm joined by Mel McCree and Sarah Lawfull, and we are talking about all things Forest School. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Forest School's approach, but specifically we're going to think about the role of the adult and the child. And also the thing that often causes a lot of debate is that element of risk. Why risk taking is important, but things like fire making, maybe stick whittling, things that involve tools that can make practitioners a little bit nervous. So Sarah, any experience, any thoughts about that?
Yes, I love it. That's my first thought. Fascinating, actually. Over many years, I've been working with early years groups myself and then visiting early years groups and seeing other practitioners sort of doing amazing things outside in the woods. I can, hand on heart, I have seen so many very young children, 3 years old, even younger, lighting fires really competently, using tools super competently. Yeah. Equally, I've worked with children in year 6 and teenagers who I would never give a knife to. So it's not about age, it's about developmental readiness and stage and confidence and the competence of the practitioners who are working with them. So you asked about the adult role. I think the adult role is to be very mindful and observing what children are doing and what they're wanting to do, and then being skilled enough to drop in an offer of a tool or a technique, bringing fire into the group at a time when they might be getting cold and hungry, and then using fire, the appropriate size fire, and very mindfully, so that the children are learning that fire is something that's risky and dangerous, but it's also very exciting. Lots of science happens around the fire, and it's where life comes from. It's how we gain our energy, and very young children learn that the energy that's coming out of the sticks that you're burning is actually energy that came from the sun and then grew in this tree and then this tree. So actually understanding the power of fire, that sunlight, it's energy that you're using then to cook your bread or get your apple on a stick and heating it up and dipping it in sugar and cinnamon and something yummy. At this point, I'd like to say Mel will know this too. Lots of people think Forest School is synonymous with marshmallows and sticks and fire. And I know people that get locked into that. They think you've got to do marshmallows every week. Well, personally, I think they're revolting, but each to his own. They're not terribly nutritional, and they're also very, very dangerous. And first aid training, if you're lucky, you get to see the horrible photo of a child's face after a marshmallow has landed on their face. So there are things that are much riskier that people seem to allow for, when actually the things that children can do very, very competently, then they're not allowed to do and able to do. There are much healthier and much tastier things to do than marshmallows, and with much more learning that comes out of them.
So obviously we want to keep our children safe. And I think you make a very good point about forest schools in that there is that kind of myth or the kind of typical, the marshmallows, the making of the fire, that kind of ideology that exists around it. And actually, yeah, things like a molten melting marshmallow, which is really difficult to say, is way more dangerous than maybe somebody whittling a stick with a potato peeler, which again, I've seen children do really effectively.
Oh, can I jump in there? Be very cheeky, Alistair. With training, we use potato peelers to peel a carrot, and we say the right tool for the right job. So, and this is another thing, people think that using the potato peeler is safer than using a knife. it really isn't. And I've actually known of a child lose the top of their thumb. They lost their thumbnail and the top of their thumb with a potato peeler, using it on a stick. So potato peelers.
I take it back.
Well, please do, and we don't recommend them.
Didn't get away with that one, did she, Alistair?
No,
important. Peeler point.
I'm not advocating the use of a potato peeler. I have observed children, obviously, who didn't attend the correct forest school training, who did give their children potato peelers, and they were very effectively whittling a stick with them. But what we're going to say is, please don't whittle with a potato peeler. But please do whittle, because whittling... Peel a carrot with a potato peeler, but don't whittle a stick. But do whittle, because whittling is just a wonderful pastime. And when I'm old and retired and I don't do this sort of thing anymore, you will find me sitting under a tree whittling, but not with a potato peeler.
We can tell you about all
I'm
kinds
glad
of
we've got that
exciting
cleared
products
up.
you can use.
Well, but then that's another brilliant point, because, I mean, in my role, I travel to schools all over the country and work with various practitioners in various different settings. And I, on more than one occasion, have seen a forest school set with people who've had children whittling with potato peelers. And because I'm not forest school trained, I just assume, obviously, that's good practice. So another really important thing I think is probably to say is to question the practice of what you do and just make sure it's always the best practice by refreshing your training, make sure you're trained in the first place, refreshing your training, and keep reading and keep reflecting as you go on to make sure that what you're doing is, what you should be doing. And I think one of the things we've touched on as well that's important is that idea of bringing the concept of forest schools, not making it a separate thing to the ethos of the pedagogy of how we teach. So bringing that back into the other learning spaces we might have, which could be your outdoor playground space in a setting, or it could be your indoor space. But making me think even about settings where they will do forest school, but then we'll come back, and if they've got banana for snack, they'll have a large chunky plastic picnic knife, and they'll be asking children to cut a banana with a plastic picnic knife, when actually in forest school they will have used a bladed knife. And again, it's about risk assessment and it's about supervision, but it's also about that parity of aspiration for what you want children to do. Mel, in your work, have you come across settings that do this particularly well, or again the struggles the settings have to try and keep that ethos running right across everything they do?
Yeah, while I was listening, I was thinking of often when people are training and they're panicking about running their first sessions, and you see them pop up on social media and forums saying, what do I do? I've planned this and I've planned that, and I think I could do some of this and some of that. And if people are being kind, which they're not always, are they, on social media, but if they're being kind, they'll be like, look, love, it's okay. Just trust that you've got plenty here. And some people will also ask, who are your group? What are they interested in? What are they doing? What are they curious about right now? Where are they at with such and such? What's your site like? What have you got? What can you use? What's the culture and the nature of your setting? Are they supportive or not? And it's kind of, I loved what you said about enchantment in the last episode as well, Alistair. Like, what would happen if we planned for enchantment instead of planning to meet whatever goals that we think we need to meet? And we know I know from mentoring teachers in schools to work outdoors that where it works best is where the whole setting is on board. It's completely transformational. And I know that a lot of practitioners will struggle not knowing or feeling at odds with the rest of the setting. So I think that's something really crucial to address, is to try and have that joined up approach across all practice. So it's not necessarily different learning or development that happens outside. It's the same stuff, but we kind of assume and we make those separate differences, don't we? Or we assume that it maybe isn't learning because we've made a sort of historic mistake there that learning happens in classrooms. That's only been the case for the last 100 years, since the Victorians sat us down at desks outside the workhouse or whatever. So, for millennia, we've learned outdoors, and learning happens everywhere, doesn't it? It happens all the time. So I think as I think it's down to us as practitioners to find our allies and find our team, so that even if you are having trouble in joining up this approach with the rest of the setting culture, that you can lean into that a bit more, because it will be beneficial to support your work. And in early years, that's going to be easier, but we also have a sort of generational amnesia, as a Scottish psychologist called Robert Hand spoke about it, is that we've forgotten in the last couple of generations, so much has changed in terms of children's independent mobility. So a lot of people who are working in the early years now haven't had those experiences that we like to get nostalgic about, of free play and independent mobility in their own childhood, or that unobserved play, or like some wild abandoned risk taking. They just haven't had that. And so, we have to be reflective practitioners in that way, and question our own assumptions, and try and get to know what we don't know, which is a challenge. So again, working with our peers really helps that, but also to trust in what we do know, trust that, we can plan for enchantment and still get our phonics done, because if we trust that is really profoundly deep and allows that child to follow their own interests and direct their own learning, we know that that's going to get us the results that we have to get at the end of the day. I know how challenging that is. When my son was young, and I was going with the received wisdom, which is don't teach them to write, don't teach them to read, just read to them a lot, inspire them, get them involved in story making, story building, and hope and trust that through that their interests will follow, and they'll pretty much teach themselves to read and write. And that was the case, but I remember sitting on my hands almost a lot, going, I really want to intervene here. And luckily, having heard myself bang on at students going, this is the best way to do it, then I was able to restrain myself. But it was really tempting. I still had it in me to sort of go, okay, let's just write your name, shall we? And
let's do this. Yes.
Yeah. So to be a reflexive practitioner, it's kind of working out where we need help. It's not all just down to us. We need help to do this, to change and work in a whole supportive culture, but work out, take risks in our own practice. So we talk about positive risk taking, but what risks could we take? Sometimes we have to make a leap of faith or trust. And sometimes we have to go a little bit feral ourselves to model to the children, and to loosen up a little bit as adults so that they can too. And I like to think about risk especially as part of a varied diet, so if we are reflective, then we can stand back and say, well, what are the ingredients that we're using in this diet that we're presenting and providing to the children, and how much are they involved in choosing those ingredients, and have we got a rainbow of different ingredients, so that where risk is concerned, we've got social and emotional risk and all the rest of it that we've spoken about. Yeah, I think that trust is really important.
Yeah, and you make a really good point, I think, which didn't occur to me till well into my teaching career, that you teach as you learnt. So you bring your preconceptions about the world, about objects, about the weather, so when I go into an open forest school experience, I am bringing with it all of my previous from childhood experience of what it is to be outdoors in an outdoor space. And for me, that happens to have been really positive, because where I was born and brought up, and my mum was a teacher, so everything we did was a flaming educational opportunity. So we were always out doing stuff. But for lots of people, they haven't had positive experiences of that.
Yeah.
So, and again, and for children who haven't, so it's that realization as a practitioner that just because you love it, or just because you've got a really positive response or a negative response, is not the same. And it's tricky, and that's why we are so skilled in the job that we do, that ability to try and step out of yourself and say, well, I'm not particularly enjoying this, but is it a good learning experience for these children? Do I compromise my own being for a little while because it's better for the children that I'm working with? And that can be the risk you're talking about, that's really challenging and really tricky. But also by doing that personally, that's where you get your personal growth. So there are huge benefits for the adults as well as the children especially if the adults are growth mindset and reflective and happy to challenge themselves. I realized, again, fairly late on, that when you feel a real sense of discomfort in your practice that's not very nice, it usually means because you are challenging yourself and you're going through a change. So learning to acknowledge and sit with the discomfort for a while rather than try and push it away. For me,
got this here.
Oh, well, there you go, you see.
Yeah, there's the stretch zone from Ronke's model of peak performance. So this is out exactly of, it's good, I've just plugged this actually. It's the Outdoor Practitioner magazine from Muddy Faces. I'm a deputy editor of it. And the last issue is all about risky play. So head over to Muddy Faces and have a look. But here we've got that, when you come out of the comfort zone into the stretch zone, not as far as the panic zone though, Alistair, which I don't think you've got in your example.
I think what you can learn to do over time, what I learned to do, is to coach yourself through the stretch zone and say, I now recognize this for what it is.
Yeah.
It will pass. And at the end of this, I will have changed in some way, shape or form. But what I'm doing is positively challenging my preconceptions about who I am, how I learn and how I teach. And I think that was never said to me early on in my teaching career. So what you do is when you get in the stretch zone, you think, oh, this is not very nice. It's not my fault. It's the children. It's the weather. It's the lack of tarpaulin, whatever it may be. But suddenly starting to think, actually, could this be me that's stopping this from happening? Or could this be me that's feeling uncertain about this? Is a really useful thing, just to realize that everybody feels that and try and embrace it and sit with it and see where it takes you.
And that takes you back to observation, doesn't it? That if you have observational skills, then you're able to take a step back and observe yourself and go, oh, I'm starting to feel like I need to take back control here. I need to maybe just let go and step back and observe myself a little bit and, give myself a little bit of space before I jump in and intervene or suggest something or structure the next moment.
Which is tricky because that's how we are taught to teach. And so unbelievably, that brings us to the end of this episode. I literally think we could have talked about that for about an hour. We will stick any references to the magazine that Mel talked about in the information that we send out, so you can go and have a look at that. In our next episode, we are going to do a little bit of myth busting and just try and pull it all together. So some of the common myths about forest schools, why we should do it and why we shouldn't do it. And also just get Sarah and Mel to share some of their kind of top tips about why forest schools is just the best thing to do. But for today's episode, all it leaves me to do is to say once again, thank you, Mel, and thank you, Sarah, and we'll see you in the next episode.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
I just want to say a massive thank you to our guests today, Mel and Sarah, for joining us and providing such brilliant and invaluable insights. So you've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and with Mel McCree and Sarah Lawfull. So if you've been inspired by our conversation today, then don't forget you can sign up via the link in the episode notes, and that will mean you're the first to hear about future episodes, but also you'll get access to some exclusive follow-up content that will include things like ideas for your setting, but also some Pinterest boards that will help you to shop for forest school resources.